So I was born in the best year that music has ever had. The year is 1983. Now, usually when I engage individuals about their pop culture knowledge of music in the early 80s, moving into the late 80s, and then I land there strategically at 1983 to check and see how many people know what they're talking about, I will quickly ask, what is the best song from 1983? Now, there are a plethora of options that you could choose from. I kid you not. There are so many classics that came out of 1983. Some run straight to the stalker hit of 1983, and they reference Police, Every Breath You Make. And they then go on and start to reference different others like the musical score. Yes, the musical score that had Maniacs on it. And also it had other big hits on there like Irene Cara's hit. And I'm like, what in the world? No, those are not the best songs from 1983. Others continue on to reference the smooth lyrics of Marvin Gaye as he suggests that there's a such thing as sexual healing. And then others settle for the real weird melody of the Eurythmic hit. And I am looking at 1983 and the sweet dreams that we celebrated, and I'm saying, nope, that's not it. And so invariably, there's a person who stands up in the crowd and they say, listen, if you're going to choose the #1 hit song of 1983, you have to go with a song off the #1 hit album of 1983. Definitely has to be Thriller, Michael Jackson. And so they throw out Beat It or Billie Jean. But then I say, no, that is not the #1 song of 1983. And usually after I share the #1 song, guess what people do? They boo, they throw tomatoes and lettuce all over me. They even threaten to tar and feather me immediately after my presentation. I say thank you for being willing to at least listen for a few moments before you take me outside and defame my name. But listen, I have for you the #1 song of 1983. It goes like this. Butterflies in the sky, I can fly twice as high. So take a look, it's in a book, Reading Rainbow. Someone knows it in here. I can go anywhere. Yeah, we remember that awesome jingle. That's the #1 song of 1983. For Reading Rainbow kicked off, and it would carry its seasons all the way to the year 2006, and then even run reruns until 2009. Some say, how can you justify Reading Rainbow's entrance into the life of America as the #1 lyrical moment of 1983? And it's simply because of the impact it had on my life. You see, LeVar Burton had a burden. His burden was to introduce the rainbow of children's literature. That children's literature was not, in fact, predominantly one color, but there were great works out there written and dealing with multiple ethnicities and colors. The issue is that many people did not know in the year of 1983 that children's literature could be that diverse because there was a dearth of multicultural diversity in children's literature. And so he tells all of the young children who would press their faces towards the TV screen, you can be anything. Just take a look. It's in a book, Reading Rainbow. The irony of this entrance song is the fact that when you watch it for yourself, you can still YouTube it today, you will not see any children of color during the lead-in segment of Reading Rainbow. It's as if, although LeVar Burton tried his best to create a rainbow when it comes to children's literature, they still couldn't get past the market. Ah, yes, that's an ominous word, the market. Let's talk about the market because we see out of the University of Wisconsin, they present this statistic. Out of 3,200 books published in 2013, only 93 of those books featured black characters or were written by black authors. Yes, if you can kind of carry your ones and borrow from the five really fast, you'll come to the conclusion that that represents 2.9% of books published here in the United States of America in 2013 illustrated the Black experience, the market. Yes, in fact, many publishers will even try to justify this position and say, listen, the market is not requesting this type of book. The market is not interested in this type of book. White families are not interested in buying children's literature with Black characters depicted on it. And since white families are the #1 consumer of children's literature, there's just not a market for it. But I would submit this evening that that's problematic for me because the term market is so nebulous. It's kind of out there in space. It exists somewhere in the imagination, but it's not tangible. We can't put our hands on it. So if in fact I wanted to walk down the street and knock on the door of the market and say, man, let African American kids in the door, let them see themselves in your stories. Please market to them. There's no address I can go to find the market. And so many individuals walk away from publishing houses with their head hung low because they don't know where to go to advocate for this cause, the market. Yeah, some writers, New York Times writer, a matter of fact, Christopher Myers, in 2014 called this the apartheid of children's literature. That children's literature, a matter of fact, is engaged in extreme segregation, that only certain stories are told, and that other stories barely climb into this market. You see, books express values. And as a little child, you may have not recognized or noticed it, but literary critics call this mapping. When a child looks at children's literature and they're trying to process what it means, they are mapping out the world around them, and they are putting certain identifiers and definitions over these symbols that they see. So what is to be said for the African American child looking for a children's book where they can find themselves? No, I think we cannot any longer get away with presenting the fact that this invisible system called the market is the excuse that justifies this disparity. For I believe that every child should have the right to dream about themselves in the stories, to see that they are valued by the world, because we may, once again, not have noticed it as children, but did you recognize that as you read these stories, they humanize you? They open you up to not only possibilities within yourself, but also possibilities within those around you. So what is to be said about the value of the African American child? Not only their value that they bring to the story, but the value that they can glean out of the story that validates their existence. For Dr. Wanda Brooks out of Temple University, she writes these words in her piece, reading a representation of themselves. She says, it is a paramount cause that all children, specifically African American children, should be able to see themselves in the stories. For as we see ourselves in story, our own existence is then validated. So, why is it that there is this disparity when it comes to children's literature in America? And why is it that African American children will be hard pressed to find their story? And why is it, if they do find themselves in a story, it is limited to the townships where only the historical nonfiction resides, stories of slavery and stories of the civil rights movement? Yes, they may be able to read about Martin and Harriet Tubman and even possibly Malcolm X, but what about the rest? Why is it that they can only access these stories? Well, literary theorists simply say that there is a selective process in children's publishing in America. Now, this selective process is not new, for it's even written about by W.E.B. Du Bois there in 1927 in the periodical entitled The Crisis. He writes there, Negro writers are not able to write on those themes which they are prepared to write with great excellence because the editors are not interested in those types of stories. Now, some would say, well, yeah, that was 1927, but our country has definitely changed. Well, Eleanor Tate, a prolific children's writer for African-American literature, she writes this in 2001, I have oftentimes had to haggle with editors who are attempting to take out of my stories the smallest of words or the smallest of actions that make my story genuinely authentic to the African-American experience. This selective process is kind of unearthed in 1977 in the book Marxism and Literature. The writer there says that the selective process simply has two jobs. It is to shape the past and pre-shape the present, which seems to guide our ability to identify and place proper labels on people, places, and things. But it's not until V.J. Harris comes behind that later and writes in his work, African American Children's Literature, 100 Years. He writes this way, it is highly problematic for the selective structure to only allow stereotypical images that only perpetuate the discarding of a people. And so that's the why. There's a selective process at work within children's publishing in the United States of America, and that selective process has been very clear for hundreds of years, that we only want certain stories, and we cannot have too many of those stories because the market does not call for it. But how many students in urban cities around the nation are desperate for this market to exist? How many young children during the paramount years where they are identifying themselves and their environment and trying to figure out where they fit in the world, how many of those children need that market, need to see themselves in the stories? So the question is, what can we do about it? What should be done? Well, I want to make 3 suggestions of how to change around this trend. The first suggestion is we need more African American children's book authors. But not individuals who are simply trying to take a page out of history and write down in children's vernacular what they think a child will understand about our forefathers and foremothers. No, in fact, we need African American literature that is intellectual and fictional. For it is fiction where the imagination really flies. As you engage children on worlds that they've never seen and the possibility of an existence that they never even thought was possible. We need African American writers. Now, some may pause me there and say, well, why is it just African American writers? Well, I believe it is because there's a thing called cultural consciousness that is a requirement in the literary children's field. Simply stated, cultural consciousness is when a person writes from a perspective that they understand because they have lived it. Jacqueline Wilson writes it this way: there is one major prerequisite for writing African American literature, and that prerequisite is simply this: you must know what it's like to be a black child. We also need more African American illustrators. Walter Dean Myers, he writes this, that in 1969, when he first came into the industry, he looked and saw that there was hardly any representation of the African American experience that could not be tied to a flawed stereotype. And then he follows up that by saying, but yet, right now in America, over 40% of public school students around our nation are from the Black or Latino descent. We need more illustrators to not just illustrate the Black experience, but to do it justice, to illustrate with excellence and accuracy. And finally, we need more African American owned publishing houses. For I do believe that if the market is trying to strap the publishers from taking risks on investing in African American literature, then maybe our own people are better equipped to take that risk, to invest not only in a profit margin, but to also invest in the lives of our young, to make sure they can see themselves, to make sure their imagination includes their own story. See, I'm an individual that doesn't believe too much in just talking about a problem unless you are willing to be a part of the solution. And so I started my own journey. In 2014, the month of May, I completed my first children's book. And no, I didn't want to go the independent publisher route. Based on the research that I have studied, I wanted to see this book make it into the market that so many are saying does not exist. And so I wrote my story. I prepared my proposal and I sent it out around the nation, hoping beyond hope that the door would open for me when it had been closed for so many other authors before me. And yes, I got responses. Letters came back in the mail, but all of them ended with the same line. Yes, they said, "Oh, this story is so moving. Oh man, we enjoyed this story. Man, this story is not only relevant, but it is compelling." And the affirmations went on, but they always ended with this: "But we do not publish these types of stories." So my question to the publishing industry in America is, well, when will we? When will we publish these types of stories? When will we validate the experience of the African American child? When will we let that child know that not only is their experience valuable, but it's much more valuable than just their history of slavery and their history of the civil rights movement, but even in the realm of fiction, their story is valuable. That they too deserve the right to use their imaginations to go to other planets, to go to new worlds that they've never seen, and to see symbols of things that they've never imagined. I believe that one day I may break into that market, but for now I will simply campaign on behalf of those of you who feel called to write these stories for this demographic, making sure that under your watch, imagination will have no segregation. Thank you very much.